As an aspiring art educator, planning lessons for my future art students has been on the forefront of my mind lately. Within this particular podcast, I want to voice my current views on integrating what has been called postmodern principles into modern art curriculum. The postmodern principles being appropriation, juxtaposition, recontextualization, layering, interaction of text and image, hybridity, gazing, and representing that I will be touching on have been previously discussed and sort of loosely defined within the context of an art education article. Written by a woman named Olivia Good, her article, Postmodern Principles in Search of 21st Century Art Education, can be viewed from a link via the NAEA website. For those who are unsure, the acronym NAEA stands for the National Art Education Association. Moving on, though, I feel like this topic regarding the integration of these postmodern principles should be revisited, and I'll do my best to explain why I feel like this. The elements and principles of art are enshrined in majority of the art education textbooks today. They are considered to be universal and foundational through government mandated standards requiring us to teach specific knowledge in our discipline. The traditional elements and principles are presented viewed virtually as the essence of art making. As Good puts it, pure art education gospel. This seems problematic to me though, because although I do agree with the continuance of teaching this traditional art knowledge, I feel that without advocating a newer system of art education to be taught alongside the traditional art systems, the art students of today will be understimulated and unengaged within the current art realm. I agree with Good's claim, kind of explaining how the elements and principles of design were never what they were claimed to be, that being universal and timeless descriptors, because in all actuality, they're not even sufficient to introduce students to much modern art, because modernism has always been a tradition with two sharply different manifestations: the coolly formal and the often engaged part. But much art education has focused on artists such as Manet, Cezanne, Matisse, and Picasso, associated with what critic Clement Greenberg referred to as cold modernism. Contrasting that, hot modernism, characterized by artists such as Marcel Duchamp and the Dadaists, has often not been adequately represented in K through 12 discourses, despite the fact that such artists are far more likely to be cited as influential to today's art world. Good loosely defines the postmodern principles throughout her article, claiming her categories were derived empirically from looking at curriculum projects based on contemporary art that were developed by a group of dynamic Chicago area artists and teachers, but I want to reiterate the concepts behind each principle. The first principle being appropriation. The routine use of appropriated materials has been noted throughout many contemporary artworks, meaning that these contemporary artists are creating new art by recycling imagery in different ways, whether it be in advertisements, photography, collage, etc. We are surrounded by an immense amount of media, so why not encourage art students to take advantage of what surrounds us all on a daily basis and use that type of medium for their personal creative explorations? The next principle, juxtaposition. The modernist principle of contrast is not adequate to describe the energy generated by bringing together radically different elements. The term juxtaposition is useful in helping students to discuss the familiar shocks of contemporary life, in which images and objects from various realms and sensibilities come together in intentional clashes or in random happenings. Recontextualization. Through this particular principle, the meaning of an artwork is often interpreted based on the positioning of a familiar image in relation to other pictures, symbols, or texts with which it's not normally associated with. The term recontextualization is similar to the term deconstruction. It's a seemingly simple visual move, and it's actually been experimented with since the beginning of the Dada era. Dadaist Hannah Hoke is recognized specifically for her recontextualized artworks. But this technique has been utilized by many other artists as well, often to generate provocative responses from the public. Layering as the next principle. As images become cheap and plentiful, they're no longer treated as precious and placed carefully side by side, but instead they're often literally piled on top of each other. Layered imagery evoking the complexity of the unconscious mind is a familiar strategy of surrealist art and of early experimental approaches to photography. Multiple layers of varying transparency will increasingly be a readily available strategy to students because it's a common feature of most digital imaging programs, such as Adobe Photoshop. The next principle, interaction of text and image. Many contemporary artworks have successfully combined elements of text and image, generating rich associations between the two. Through this interplay, artworks can possess much power, and for students making and valuing art in the 21st century, they must be taught not to demand the literal matching of verbal and visual signifiers, but rather to explore disjuncture between the two modes as a source of meaning and expression. Hybridity. The next principle, Good's definition of what hybridity is within an art context basically describes artworks that take on a multimedia approach, which is now encountered in contemporary museums and galleries more frequently than traditional sculpted or painting objects. She claims that the concept of hybridity also describes the cultural blending evident in many artists' productions. Artists now often incorporate various media into their pieces, whatever they feel is necessary in order to fully investigate the subject of focus. Gazing. Within contemporary discourses, the term gaze is frequently used in relation to recognizing that when talking about the act of looking, it is important to consider who's doing the looking and who's actually being looked at. Gazing is also associated with issues of knowledge and pleasure, and it's viewed as a form of power in some contexts. The term gazing is used often in art history and film studies to investigate the ways in which our notions of others are constructed through proprietary acts of looking and representing, which leads to the final principle, representant. This principle refers to U.S. urban street slang for proclaiming one's identity and affiliations. It really describes a strategy of location, one's artistic voice within one's personal culture and history of origin. A frequent goal in many art classes is to create meaningful self-expression through art. Self-creating self when they are shown examples of contemporary artists using art making to explore problems and potentials inherent in his or her political and cultural settings. These different postmodern principles will obviously differ depending on cultural issues and the current historical context of the school and community that they're going to be introduced into, but by introducing these principles into art projects and lessons, students will be exposed to contemporary art that's around them. Through this, students will gain the skills necessary to be able to comfortably converse about and participate in contemporary art and cultural conversations. That's why I feel it's necessary that we as art educators begin to think about these postmodern principles.